Hi, this is PatZi with the Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind a book. And today, my very special guest is Steven Hartov, and I am so happy to welcome him to Joy on Paper Live because he's been on the radio program many times. And here is his book that we're going to be talking about today, The Last of the Seven. So here's Steven, and I know that you're going to enjoy listening to our conversation. I am so happy to welcome you because I love all of your books. But we're going to concentrate a little bit on World War II this time because you have two wonderful books that concentrate on World War II. So let's talk about them. And here you are with your two books, The Last of the Seven, which is your most recent one, and The Soul of a Thief. And both of them are so terrific. So give us just a little background about the books, and then we'll talk about The Last of the Seven today.
Thanks so much for having me. I always appreciate it, and it's great to be on with you. And you're a fabulous champion of writers and writing, and it's really comfy to be with you in your studio. Yes, this is the vein that I'm in now, PatZi. I'm writing historical fiction, a trilogy about World War II. And I was a child of that period, born in 1953. My mom was an Austrian refugee from Nazi Austria. My dad was a GI. And I grew up in that atmosphere. All of their friends and so forth were the greatest generation. And when I began as a writer, years after that, obviously, I was already in the military myself when I first started thinking that I'd like to write. I had read like crazy as a kid and as a teenager and a college student, all the classic fiction authors. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that I realized I wanted to write about World War II. And actually, The Soul of a Thief was the first in the series, and The Last of the Seven is the most recent. The Soul of a Thief was about a half Jewish, half Christian Austrian youth who gets recruited into the German army and is the adjutant to a SS colonel in France just before the Normandy invasion. And at the end of that book, these seven characters suddenly appear. And you know how I'm sure authors tell you this all the time. Sometimes a character just steps onto the stage and you're not sure where they came from. These seven characters who appeared at the end of The Soul of a Thief were seven British commandos, Jewish kids, youth from Austria, Germany, and Alsace-Lorraine, and in German uniforms. All of my works are based on historical truths. So from that came The Last of the Seven, which is my larger book so far in the series. And that's the one that's just come out. That's the one that people are reading now. And that's a story about seven of these command. Actually, it's about one of them who survived something that I can't really reveal in the first part of the book without ruining it, and later rejoins a larger group of these commandos. But it's a true story about these German, Austrian, and Alsace-Lorraine Jews who were all orphaned by the Nazis, all joined the British Army, all became commandos, started off in North Africa, and they wore German uniforms, and they were very brave young men who operated behind German lines. And that's the kernel of The Last of the Seven. That's where we jump off into this adventure that goes from 1942 until D-Day.
The Last of the Seven takes place in Sicily. Let's talk a little bit about where you got, as you said, you followed this story along and you eventually got it to where you're in Sicily.
It was interesting, Patsy, the way that I followed history in terms of where these troops would have gone after North Africa, because the story opens in North Africa. The beginning of World War II was largely fought, as far as the Allied forces were concerned, were largely fought in North Africa against the German Afrika Korps and Erwin Rommel, the very famous German tank general. And after Rommel was defeated at El Alamein and Tobruk and so forth, the Allies then moved on to the Italian theater. But in order to get to Italy, first they had to invade Sicily, which is at the bottom of Italy's boot. It's a very large island. And so the Brits and the Americans invaded Sicily in 1943, and I decided that's where the centerpiece of my book would take place. It's where my main character, Bernard Froelich, would have his development as a young man, and where he would begin to understand what his role in life was supposed to be, and where his new commando unit, based on X Troop, the British commando unit, would be formulated for a specific mission, and that would take place in Sicily. I decided, because Froelich is badly wounded at the beginning of the book and is going to be rehabilitated in a field hospital, that field hospital would be located in a monastery in Sicily. Now, I didn't know exactly where I would pinpoint that monastery, so that's when I started my research. That's when I found this beautiful monastery in Sculiana, which is a beautiful Italian town on the southern part of the island. And because I always go to the places I'm going to write about, that's when I picked myself up and I went to Sicily. And as it turns out, that monastery also has a little bed and breakfast in it. Maybe they have 5 rooms. So I stayed in the monastery. And that's where I took notes on the whole centerpiece of the book and did some actual writing there in Sculiana.
We're going to show some photos of that in a little while, but let's take a little trip to Sicily. For people who don't know anything about Sicily, it is a beautiful place, isn't it?
Yes.
I loved my time in Sicily. It was wonderful. Did so much traveling around. And when I was there, I noticed, of course, still remnants of World War II. There are still areas where you can find, there's an area I remember seeing burnt out tanks that are still visible there. It's quite
Yes.
the thing. But for people who haven't been there, I thought perhaps they would like to see a little bit about Sicily.
In the Sahara, the sun could make a man bleed. The Last of the Seven, a novel of World War II by Steven Hartov.
Wow, Steven, that's quite a promo.
Wasn't that nice?
Beautiful.
That was the music was written by my son Jesse Hartov, who writes for a lot of television, and he writes for big TV shows, streaming shows. He writes for some big video games, and he and his partner Alex Siegel do these book trailers on occasion, and it's Alec does them for major Hollywood studios. So I was very grateful to have the boys do that for me.
It's beautifully done, and it does set the scene. So now let's talk more about the story. So you started to tell us the main character, and with all of the research you did, your book just comes alive. Me having walked in really the battlefields of Sicily, because that's one of the things I'm always interested in. A lot of tourists just want to stay in the fancy hotels, which was fun. And they have some great hotels in Sicily, amazing. But one of the things that I do, and because I have hundreds and hundreds of military books. I have 200 books just about Napoleon and another 200
Wow.
about Churchill and World War II and the First War, because, of course, that's where Churchill started. I had years of obsession with Churchill. So, of course, the minute I get anywhere, I'm looking for battlefields. So, tell us more about the story, and then how you also walked in the footsteps of the battle that really people don't understand how important over the years poor Sicily has seen a lot of wars.
Oh yeah, Sicily has seen wars over the ages and for thousands of years. And it's been the crossroads of the Mediterranean for that sort of thing, for power players struggling with each other. And the Sicilians have endured an awful lot of occupations, much like the Afghanis have. The Sicilians were occupied by the Nazis and by Mussolini's troops for the first few years of the war, and then they were liberated by the Allies. The Brits and the Americans came ashore in different spots. The Brits came ashore in Gela, and when I was there, I'm sure you've seen the exact same things. I go exploring where people don't go. I'll see a German machine gun bunker and turn off the road and see where that's leading to, what little farmhouse, what small village. I remember first arriving on the very first day in Sicily and driving from Catania to Gela and just grabbing a sandwich somewhere, and I looked across the street from this little deli that I was sitting at by myself, and I saw a gigantic mural on a brick wall of the invasion of Sicily. That's how important those events still are to the Sicilians. And as I was saying, I have to live in a place to really write it well. I can't do that from Google research or something like that, PatZi, and I'm sure you're the same way. And so I went and stayed in this monastery. Now, when I chose the monastery, I chose it for its physical location and the way it looked physically. I didn't know what its function was during World War II. But while I was staying there and I befriended the sister who was shepherding tourists like myself, I asked her what was here during World War II, and she said an American field hospital. So I knew I was in the right place. And I then transported as a character my own uncle, who in World War II was a heroic field combat surgeon. As a matter of fact, he got the Silver Star at the Battle of the Bulge for some heroic deeds there. But I decided, I knew him so well when I was younger, and he was such an imposing character, that I took him and transported him into that place. So he becomes the commander of the field hospital in my book, in the central part of the book, which takes place in Sicily. And then that's also the place where this character is Froelich finds himself. He's a lost boy. Like my mother's brother, he has fled from Nazi-occupied Germany, and he has lost his family. He has joined the British Army out of desperation and revenge, but he has lost his identity with his family and his religion and so forth. And it isn't until he spends time in Sicily recuperating from these horrible wounds that he falls in love with a young Sicilian girl who's working at the field hospital. And through her nurturing, he begins to discover who he is as a young man. So the central part of the book is very, I'd say, Hemingwayian in that way. It's got a little taste of For Whom the Bell Tolls in it. And then thereafter, when the commando unit forms together again and he becomes their commander, that's when they go off on this mission that only they can accomplish, because they all speak fluent German. They all have German mannerisms. They all know how to portray Nazis in the correct uniforms. And only troops like them during World War II could actually get behind German lines successfully and pull off impossible missions. So that's where the book leads us at last into this final virtually impossible mission that they have to pull off after having gathered together and trained very hard for it.
It's a stunning book. And as always with all of your books, you're right. It is so important that you get to the place where you're writing about, if you can, because it just adds so much dimension to your writing. It's funny, when I was there, it was really great. Of course, I was traveling around, and I was traveling around in a bus most of the time. I was traveling cheap, just not spending a lot of money, although I'd been in Palermo and I'd stayed in the fanciest hotel there and I loved it. But I wanted to get with the people. I just wanted to be out there. And I took a bus actually down to Syracuse. It's a long trip, and there's a lot of side places to stop. And so I stayed in different little pensions along the way. And what I loved is I would talk to the people who were very old then, but they had been there. And in that little video I showed, there's a bunch of kids on a Jeep and they were greeting the GIs. And I talked to some of those people, could have been in that Jeep, because they were telling me how they were there. They remembered. They were 5, 6, 8 years old, and they'd be running around, and they were telling me how one of their grandmothers would come out with these huge baskets of bread to give to the GIs and also the British, and bowls of spaghetti, and they remembered it. It was so beautiful, their stories.
I had the same experience. I'm always looking for the elderly people who might remember something about the time period that I'm writing about. And I found the same thing in Sculiana. I found elderly people. This one elderly gentleman took me on a hike up into the back alleys of Sculiana, of Agrigento. It was in Agrigento, until we came to a bronze plaque hidden away, dedicated to the American Rangers who had fought there in that town, and was telling me stories about being a kid there and remembering how happy they were that finally the Americans and the Brits had showed up. Same thing. And you can't get that from sitting at your computer, right?
No. I think one of the joys of writing is that research. When you get to travel to places and get to talk to people and just breathe the air and know that they were there. And it's part of being a writer, keeping these stories alive and keeping the people alive and remembering them.
Absolutely. I feel so much that way. When I went from Agrigento to another little town on the very top of a hill called Sculiana, where another big piece of my center part of the book takes place, I had this feeling of ghosts from this time period in that town, and at the castle where I set some scenes and the overlooks of the town, because I had known from reading history what had transpired there. And there were very old men sitting in the square, drinking wine and smoking cigarettes, and talking to them and going up to the castle. You feel the presence of history. It takes many years, I think, to learn how to extract atmosphere from a place and put it on a page. You can't do too much of it, but you have to have tasted it to make somebody else taste it. that's the art. It's like sculpting to me.
You're right. And it comes at the strangest times. I I'm one of these people who I've always woken up early in the morning, 5 o'clock, been ready to go. And it is amazing the people that you meet at 5 o'clock in the morning and how much they would love to talk. They find somebody that say, just walk along and meet people and sit down and you it's always the cafe that's open first. Those are the people that are always I've always found so intriguing. They're the ones who are up in the morning. They need a cup of coffee. Definitely in Sicily, you get good coffee, and you just sit there. And if you're calm and you just sit back and let them talk, you don't have to drag anything out of them then, because all you have to do is say, "I'm interested in this," and I heard about this, and then they just go on, and it's one. Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah, it's fantastic. I have the same experiences in many places in the world. Not necessarily at 5 o'clock in the morning. Those are my army days. And I did a lot of 5 o'clocks in the morning, but I also find the same experience at midnight in certain places with the characters who are out late. The thing I think, Patsy, that people don't always understand, because people in general like to talk about themselves. If you can just trigger somebody in the right way, just like you said just now, and say, I'm interested, do you know about this particular thing? Where were you when you were 8 years old? Once they start to talk, you can learn an awful lot if you know how to listen. If you're a writer, particularly of fiction, you have to know how to listen and how to absorb and how to hear the nuances. And then get it onto paper is a whole nother story, of course. But
And that is a different story. That is where you have to learn your craft, right?
exactly. And that takes some years. Some writers definitely have a natural talent and some don't. But it's an art. It's an art form that takes years to develop, just like sculpting.
We have a few more photos that you might want to comment about here.
Those photographs are very interesting. The one that's right below me of the piratish looking fellows sitting in their command cars with all of their heavy Bren guns and machine guns are Special Air Service commandos from North Africa. And the British Special Air Service became the first well-known commando unit formed by the Allies that fought in that theater of World War II. And up until they were formulated, the Brits were very circumspect about having fellows fight not in their regulation uniforms and so forth. It was considered ungentlemanly warfare. But these guys proved that sort of combining piracy with commando tactics could get them a long way and do a lot of damage to the Germans. Now, what's interesting about my book, The Last of the Seven, is that the Jewish commandos in the British Army, and it was a very small group called the Special Interrogation Group, which was just a cover name for these Jewish commandos. And they were taken on by a British officer who realized he could turn them into a valuable asset because they all spoke fluent German, they knew German slang, they could pass themselves off as Germans, and he acquired for them captured German uniforms and weapons and equipment. And he realized that he could use them to get these Special Air Service fellows behind German lines. And sometimes the Jewish commandos posing as Nazi soldiers would lead truckloads of these SAS commandos behind German lines as if they were their prisoners, as if the Germans were taking them to a prisoner of war camp. And thereby all of these Allied commandos would get behind German lines and raid German airfields, and they assaulted Tobruk, and they pulled off very daring deeds, and many of them were killed. Now, the other photograph is of 7 German paratroopers, and the reason that I use that photograph is because that's how my German, Austrian, and French Jews as British commandos would have been dressed as German troops when they operated behind German lines. And these young men were beyond brave because at that time when Hitler realized that British forces were pulling off these commando raids and wreaking havoc with Rommel's forces, he issued something called the Kommandobefehl, which was an order to execute any commandos that were captured on the spot, no trial. So particularly these Jewish refugees knew that if they were caught, they were dead men. And they did it anyway, which speaks to their characters, of course, that they were perhaps in some ways in despair of having a future life after the war because they had all lost their families. But on the other hand, they were ready to sacrifice themselves to avenge their families and take on the Nazis.
It's interesting. I had another Steve on Joy on Paper Live recently, Steve Anderson, and he writes a series of books about, it's called the Casper Brothers series. In those books about how the Germans tried a similar thing. Germans tried to pretend to be Americans during the Battle of the Bulge, which of course your uncle would have known about, and my father was also in the Battle of the Bulge.
There you go.
But in the case of the Germans, they weren't as good at impersonating Americans. You've seen probably that movie where they ask a German who's supposed to be an American about baseball. They could quickly find people out. But in this case, where the Jews were actually they spoke the languages from their childhood, so they really could get away with pretending to be Germans.
Yes, they were exceptional at pretending to be Germans. And I actually, because I spent a lot of time as a youth in Israel, and I was in the American Merchant Marine for a while, and then I was in the Israeli Army in the IDF as a paratrooper and as an intel guy. And then I finished out my military career in the New York Guard as a major up here in the Northeast of the United States. But I knew a couple of these former Special Interrogation Group ex-troopers, and they were older gentlemen. And they were exceptionally different. They came from German cultures, so they could pretend very facilely to be German troops, but it was also so dangerous. And at first, PatZi, the British High Command did not believe that this could work until the commander of this small unit, his name was Bertie Buck. He was a captain in the British Commandos, and he spoke multiple languages, including dead fluent German. And to prove to the British High Command that he could pull this off, he and his officer partner, his deputy, David Russell, took 3 of these young Jewish commandos. They were all in German uniforms. They went behind German lines, walked into a German army camp. The 3 younger men got on the paymaster's line with forged paybooks to collect cash pay. And the 2 officers, their officers, also in German uniform, went into the German mess and sat down and had lunch with German officers. And then they all withdrew and made their way back to Cairo. And once he had proved that he could pull that off, the German High Command said, the British High Command said, these young men can do what they claim they can do. And that's when they went into action.
Wow. It's an amazing story and a fascinating book, and you've done just a wonderful job in bringing it to life. We have a few more photos that you can talk about.
We both know that one, don't we? There is a place in Sicily, outside of Agrigento, in the southern part of Sicily, where you come upon it, you're not sure that what you're seeing is real. It is a mile-long, dusty plateau. And now the ruins you're looking at there are the most ruinous that are up there, because The other ruins, they are Greek temples in complete, intact condition. It's like the Parthenon was dropped out of the sky and landed there without any damage. And there are a number of temples like that up there. And it's a mile long, and you walk down this sort of ghost-like set of ruins, and it's as if nothing has changed in 1800 years. And it's just a stunning place. And they will have a concert there once in a while, or they will have a sculpture exhibit, or they will have historians come and lecture there, and tourists arrive by the busloads and just walk around with their mouths open. You can't believe what you're seeing. And it's just such a magnificent place that I hadn't heard of it until I went there, and that I set a little bit of the centerpiece of my book in there as well, because it's just, it's such a rare and ghost-like, magnificent set of ruins that it's one of those things, if you come across it, you got to stick it in a book.
Exactly. It's breathtaking. You just stand there and you're in awe. It's so incomprehensible. A photo never does justice to it until you are standing there. You feel so little. These are so magnificent.
It's incredible. And this photograph that I happen to send you it's a beautiful photograph, but as we both know, if you could look to the right and up the hill, you'd see a temple that is just enormous. You feel like you're like an ant standing next to it, and the columns are so wide and so high, and the roof is sitting on these beautiful curled columns, completely intact.
I know.
It's like,
now that is a place to be early in the morning when the sun rises. To be there
yes,
it's unforgettable. I was there at sunrise.
it is amazing.
It's difficult enough to build it on a mainland, but this is really an island. It's a big island, but still, it's you don't know how they did it. As you say, when you see the size and you feel so small, and they did it, it really is something that people should see. I think Sicily is a great place because you've got everything there: the culture, the history, the lovely people, the great food. I don't know. Just fantastic food. It's a beautiful place.
And also very inexpensive rents.
Yes. Very.
If you want to go rent like a 3-bedroom apartment in Sculiana, which is right near the ocean, it's gorgeous. I was walking around looking at rentals going, this cannot be. $800 a month, you can get a 3-bedroom apartment with a balcony and bougainvillea and gorgeous flowers, and it overlooks a wine cellar, and it's like, really?
I know, it's wonderful. It is really fantastic, but it's also it's part of this joy of writing. I always say Joy on Paper is a program for writers and those who dream of writing. And one of the reasons I'm doing this Joy on Paper Live is to tell people, don't just dream, do it. It's inspiring. I had a photo of something else for you.
Oh, that's the monastery.
Yeah.
That's the monastery, Spirito Santo. That's the front of it on this side of me over here. That's what is now the front courtyard with the belfry. And you walk through that front you walk through that front entrance, and you're in this beautiful courtyard on the other side, which is just magnificent. It's very sort of pinkish sandstone, granite, and it has a beautiful raised garden inside. And this was all in World War II utilized by Allied forces. And staying there, I sat there and actually wrote tracts and pieces of the centerpiece of the book in the place where it took place. So you can't substitute that. We have to do a lot of our work at our desks later on, of course. In my case, it's in an attic office where it's a neutral atmosphere. But I personally feel that the best way to bring that stuff home to your book is to go there and drag it back with you in a way. So that was quite an experience.
It's wonderful. I think the book is wonderful, and I so hope that people will read it, be inspired, and I hope be inspired to even take a trip to Sicily. Well, Stevie, that was great. Thank you so much. We're going to have you back to talk about third book.
Oh, first of all, PatZi, thank you so much for having me on. It's a joy to be with joy.
Thank you.
And that next book is coming out when I finish it. I've been working on it since the last one was released, and I have to spend some time in France coming up because, as we've said, we got to be there to make you feel it, make you taste it. I'll be in France for a while working on that, and then Belgium and Germany and so forth. And
I tried to follow my father's footsteps through the Battle of the Bulge as much as I could find the locations that he would tell me about because they didn't like to talk about their experiences. He, of course, was in the Battle of the Bulge, and I know on Christmas Eve, 1944, I know exactly where he was. His feet were frozen, as so many of the soldiers were. It was a he had before that, there are only two things that he said ever happened good in that war. He got to speak to Omar Bradley, who he admired, and really, as all the GIs loved Omar Bradley. So it was very special. But he also got to see Marlene Dietrich. She came right to the front. She was such a brave woman. Many American and British actors and actresses went to play at the USO, but they stayed back. But she wanted to go right up to the fields as close as she could get, and she really risked her life. The landmines, that alone would scare anybody, but my father was walking with his guys along the side of a road. She drove past them in the Jeep, and they didn't know, of course, who it was. And then the Jeep stopped, and they backed up, and she stood up, and she took her helmet off, and her magnificent hair just flowed. And my father, it was a memory that my father never forgot. And he said later on, for three of those guys, that was probably the last woman they ever saw. A few weeks later, they were gone.
wow.
So I'm sure if you're, is it centered around the Battle of the Bulge? Since
Yes.
Belgium.
Yes, we'll have to chat some more about that when I get to writing that section, exchange some stories and so forth. Two of my uncles were there.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a joy to talk to you as always. And
Thank you, PatZi. Thank you.
and I salute you too. Thank you. Bye-bye now. Bye.
Take care.
Okay. Well, I enjoy talking to Steven Hartov. I always do. And this book is so good. I do hope that you'll get it and be inspired. You know, that's the wonderful thing about books. You can just get so inspired. One, perhaps you will write a story and you will have a story in the back of your mind that you've been wanting to write for years, and you'll start writing it. And then, of course, if not that, you might be inspired to get up and go. And if you're going to go, so if you have a family story, I'm going to have a special thing on my Patreon page, a special group of people who want to write micro memoirs, stories about their families mostly. And I will have a lot of advice on how to do that. So I hope that you will, right now, all you have to do is subscribe. All you dog lovers out there, because did you know that you should read to your dog? Really, I'm telling you, it's true.